Welcome to the Deep Dive. We pull essential strategic knowledge straight from your source material. Today, we're tackling a big one. What it really means to be a trustee for a Texas Local Firefighters Retirement Act plan. A TLF-FRA plan. This role carries some serious long-term weight.
It absolutely does. You're not just managing funds day to day. You're safeguarding promises, decades into the future, 50 years even. So our source today is the big TLFFRA Trustee Manual, comprehensive stuff. And our mission really is to cut through all that complexity. We want to give you the core essentials, fiduciary duties, the financial nuts and bolts, investment basics so you can hit the ground running as an effective trustee.
Okay, let's unpack that. The manual really hammers home this idea that your core identity as a trustee is being a long-term strategic thinker. You're thinking 5, 10, even 50 years out. And often, that means you have to stand firm, defend the plan stability against immediate pressures about contributions or benefits.
And that entire identity, that whole role, it rests squarely on your fiduciary duty. It's because you have direct control, discretionary control, over the fund's assets. That's what makes you a fiduciary in the eyes of the law. The simplest definition. Acting primarily for the benefit of the plan members and their beneficiaries. That's the bedrock.
Okay, but that immediately brings up what seems like the toughest part in practice, the two-hat problem. Let's say you were put on the board by the active firefighters, or maybe appointed by the city, the sponsor. How does the manual say you handle it when you have to vote against something popular, like a benefit bump, because it puts the plan's long-term health at risk?
Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road. The manual is, well, pretty blunt about it. You must set aside that specific interest group. When you're acting as a trustee, your duty is solely, exclusively, to the plan itself as a whole financial entity, not to the group that got you there. Your job is to improve the plan, period, even if it means disagreeing sometimes.
To really live up to that, the manual highlights two really key duties: prudence and diversification. Now, prudence sounds straightforward: act with skill, be diligent. But what does it specifically mean for managing these big institutional funds?
Right. It's a bit more than just common sense caution. It means acting with the care, skill, and diligence that a prudent person managing a similar kind of enterprise would use. So the standard is high. It's like a specialized institutional manager. And a big part of prudence is the duty to diversify. But it's not just, buying a few different stocks. The crucial insight here is diversifying with uncorrelated assets. You need things in the portfolio whose values don't all go up and down together. That's how you lower the risk of getting slammed by a sudden market shock.
Okay, and here's something that really jumped out at me: the liability. It's not just about your actions. The manual talks about serious co-fiduciary liability.
This is absolutely critical, yes. It's not just about being personally honest. It means the board itself acts like a kind of mandatory internal watchdog. You're legally obligated, as a trustee, to call out breaches or misconduct you see from other fiduciaries. If you know something's wrong, maybe another board member, maybe a hired manager, and you just look the other way, you could share the legal liability. Silence can basically mean you're complicit.
Wow, okay. That definitely raises the stakes. So, building on that integrity piece, let's talk personal interests. The rules around conflicts of interest sound strict.
They have to be. The main thing is you have to disclose any potential conflict between your personal finances and the system's interests. And usually resolving it means you just step back, you withdraw from any discussion or vote on that specific issue. The manual lists some specifics too, things that are prohibited. Pretty common sense, really. Like you can't use your trustee position to get better investment deals than anyone else, and you definitely can't be involved in buying, selling, or leasing property with the retirement system if you personally have a stake in that property. Simple rule: no personal gain from the fund, zero.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit from personal ethics to how the board operates as a group. Governance. The source material really pushes the idea of setting explicit written policies. Governing by policy, not just reacting to stuff.
Exactly. That's about being proactive, right? Setting the rules of the road up front. The manual has a neat little checklist for good policies. They need to be explicit, clearly spelled out. They have to be current, kept up to date, literal, they mean what they say. Central, all kept together in one place so people can find them. And, maybe surprisingly, brief. Keep it concise so people actually use them.
And when the board is setting these policies, especially around complex things like investments, they're usually getting help from outsiders, actuaries, lawyers, investment managers. But the manual stresses that the board can't just offload the responsibility.
That's right. You can delegate the work, the task, but you, the board, keep the ultimate fiduciary responsibility for the decisions made. So the critical governance piece there is due diligence. You have to really scrutinize the service providers you hire. Are the fees reasonable for the value you're getting? Check their performance regularly. And super important, when you hire an investment manager, the board must get it in writing from them, an acknowledgement that they understand and accept they have fiduciary responsibilities to the fund. That legally locks in the standard of care.
All this complexity, legal, financial, Siri, it really explains why the Texas legislature put in those minimum educational training requirements, the MAT rules. This seems like absolutely foundational stuff for any trustee listening. What's involved there?
Yeah, it's mandatory for a reason. New trustees have to get at least 7 hours of training done within their first year, and it has to cover all 7 core areas. That's fiduciary matters, governance, ethics, investments, actuarial matters, benefits administration, and risk management. The legislature picked those 7 because they're all linked. You can't make smart investment decisions if you don't understand the actuarial side, which you're actually trying to fund.
That connection takes us right into the next big section, the plan's financial engine. TLFFRA plans are defined benefit, or DB plans. What's the key strategic takeaway from that label?
The big implication is who holds the risk. Defined benefit means the employee gets a specific, guaranteed benefit amount in retirement. If the plan's investments don't perform as expected, the shortfall risk. That lands squarely on the plan, which means ultimately the employer and maybe taxpayers might have to make up the difference through higher contributions. That's why pre-funding is the goal. You need contributions plus investment income to reliably cover benefits and expenses over the long haul. It's about security and fairness between generations.
And to figure out that long-term obligation, we lean heavily on the actuarial valuation. We hear terms like actuarial accrued liability or AAL. What makes that number so important?
The AAL essentially is the estimated present value of all the pension benefits participants have already earned based on their past service. It's a measure of the promises the plan already owes today. The actuary also looks at the total picture, the present value of future benefits, PVFB, which includes that AAL plus the cost of benefits being earned in the current year, the normal cost. These calculations tell you what you need to fund.
Okay, and all of this hinges on one absolutely critical number, an assumption really. The discount rate. This feels like the aha moment in the financial section. Why does this single rate have such a massive impact?
Oh, it's huge. Absolutely the biggest lever. The discount rate is usually based on the long-term expected rate of return on the plan's investments. The median was around 7.5% for TLF-FRA plans back in 2019. Here's the thing. The higher you set that assumed rate of return, the lower the calculated AAL looks today, and the lower the required contributions seem. And that's where the manual gives a major warning. Avoid the trap. They call it putting the cart before the horse.
You mean you can't just pick a high discount rate because you want lower contributions and then tell your investment managers, okay, go earn this.
Precisely. That's backwards. The assumed rate of return, your discount rate, must flow logically from your established prudent asset allocation strategy. If your realistic, prudent return assumptions show you have a funding gap, your fiduciary duty is to face it maybe through higher contributions, maybe plan design changes, not to just, fiddle with the assumption to make the numbers look better on paper.
So when trustees are tracking the plan's health day-to-day, they look at the funded ratio, basically, assets divided by that AAL. But markets bounce around like crazy. To avoid contribution rates going wild every year, actuaries use something called asset smoothing. Why is that a key policy call for a trustee?
Right. Asset smoothing typically involves phasing in investment gains and losses over several years. Often 5 is basically a shock absorber. It's a tool designed to dampen that short-term market volatility. The goal is to keep contribution rates relatively stable and predictable for the plan sponsor, the city or county. But deciding how much smoothing to do, like a 3-year smooth versus a 5-year smooth, that's a real policy choice. And it ties right back to that core tension we talked about. Are you prioritizing short-term contribution stability or reflecting the plan's true economic funded status more quickly for long-term security?
And if things really head south, if that funded status drops too low for too long, there's a regulatory backstop, right? The Funding Soundness Restoration Plan, or FSRP.
That's the state safety net kicking in. If the plan's projected time to pay off its unfunded liability, the amortization period, stretches past 30 years for a couple of valuations in a row, then the plan and its sponsor have to formally create an FSRP. And there are some hard deadlines coming up too. After September 1st, 2025, if that amortization period goes over 40 years even once, or if it's over 30 years and the funded ratio is below 65%, FSRP is triggered immediately. Serious stuff.
Which brings us logically to the investment strategy itself. That's the engine that's supposed to generate that assumed rate of return we talked about. The goal seems clear: earn enough, but don't blow up the fund.
Exactly. It's a balancing act. And the key driver, the most important decision according to the source material, is asset allocation. That strategic mix of different types of assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, maybe alternatives like private equity, that mix is the primary thing that determines your long-run returns and how bumpy the ride will be, the volatility.
And that whole strategy, that mix, gets written down in the investment policy statement, the IPS. Sounds like the board's rule book for investments.
It is. It's mandatory, and it's essentially the blueprint for prudent investing. The board has to formally adopt a written IPS. It has to cover things like safety, diversification, liquidity needs. And you have to file it with the State Pension Review Board within 90 days. It's where you document how you're balancing the plan's need to grow assets over the long term, which might argue for taking more risk, with the absolute necessity of having cash available to pay benefits to retirees today, liquidity.
Now, when it comes to actually implementing that IPS, boards often hire outside managers. This leads to that ongoing debate: active versus passive management.
Right. Active management means paying managers, often higher fees, to try and beat a specific market benchmark index. Passive management means aiming to just match the benchmark's performance, usually with much lower fees, often using index funds or ETFs. The trustee's job is to weigh this prudently. The manual notes and lots of studies agree that in certain very efficient markets, large U.S. stocks are a prime example. It's really hard for active managers to consistently beat the market after accounting for their higher fees. So choosing a lower-cost passive approach in those areas can be a very sound fiduciary-minded decision. The key question you always have to ask: are we actually getting enough extra performance from active management to justify those higher fees? Is it adding value, net of cost?
Okay, finally, let's touch on the rules around just being open and transparent. These are public systems, so trustees operate under pretty strict rules about access to meetings and records, starting with the Texas Open Meetings Act, TOMA.
Yeah, TOMA is non-negotiable. Board meetings generally have to be open to the public. And here's a key point: a quorum of the board that's a majority discussing public business privately, even informally, like through emails or texts, that could be a TOMA violation. Very dangerous ground.
And the rules for letting the public know what you'll be discussing seem really specific.
They are. The agenda for the meeting has to clearly describe the specific topics you're going to discuss. You can't just put vague things like old business or investment update. You need real detail. And that agenda has to be posted publicly at least 72 hours before the meeting. Now, there are exceptions for going into a closed or executive session, things like discussing personnel issues, getting legal advice, maybe real estate deals. But, and this is crucial, any final action, any decision, any vote, that must happen back in the open public meeting.
And if someone from the public wants to see the records, the documents, that falls under the Public Information Act, the PIA.
Right. If you get a written request for records, email, fax, letter, you generally have a duty to promptly produce the information. A key legal point here from the source: as the governmental body, you generally can't ask the person why they want the information or what they plan to do with it. Your job is to comply with the request, maybe ask for clarification if it's unclear, but not to gatekeep based on their motives.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The trustee's core identity, those really high fiduciary standards and ethics, the critical link between actuarial math and investment choices, and these strict transparency rules. It's a huge amount of responsibility.
It really is. But you see how it all connects back, right? It funnels back to that single core duty: securing the long-term promise made to members. We saw how tempting it might be to tweak that discount rate to lower today's contributions, but prudence says you absolutely shouldn't. We saw that good governance means writing clear policies, and knowing that hiring experts doesn't mean you've offloaded your own responsibility.
So, thinking about that, what's the final big strategic challenge, the core tension we should leave folks thinking about, the kind of overarching policy decision that really shapes the plan's future?
I think it really boils down to that conflict we touched on: balancing stability versus security. We know these DB plans hold the investment risk. We know trustees use tools like asset smoothing to try and keep contributions stable for the employer, for the taxpayer in the short term. So the fundamental question becomes, how aggressively should the board manage its funding policy, things like the amortization period for paying off debt, to get the plan back to 100% funded status? Because the choice you make there, a faster payoff versus a slower one, fundamentally decides who bears more of the plan's inherent economic risk. Is it the current taxpayer, through potentially higher but potentially more volatile contributions now? Or is it the future beneficiary and taxpayer who might inherit a bigger, maybe less manageable funding problem down the road? That's the constant strategic balancing act. That's the fiduciary choice you have to keep making.